In today's video, I've got Emily Bryson with me, and we're going to discuss the topic of fonts, size of fonts, choices of fonts, text, exercises, images, and little design layout tips in order to make more accessible learning materials. Emily's going to introduce herself. In the meantime, if you want to catch any more videos on the topic of materials writing, why not subscribe to the channel?
So I am Emily Bryson. I am a materials writer and ESOL lecturer at City of Glasgow College. And for a few years at City of Glasgow College, I delivered some training on creating accessible learning materials, and I've delivered quite a lot of training on this over the years. So today I'm going to take you through accessible layout, which is really quite important to make sure that your materials are accessible and readable and easy to read for all your students.
When you talk about accessible materials, are we talking about a particular type of student or any type of student?
Well, I think if you make it accessible, then it makes it accessible for all, but it could be for students who have dyslexia, or students who are maybe colorblind, or students with a different SBLD, specific learning difference. So yeah, but if you make it accessible for one student, then you make it accessible for all students. So everybody wins, really.
And what are some, when you open course books or you look at materials that teachers write, what are some of the typical things that you notice straight away that make it difficult for learners sometimes?
The fonts are too small. For one thing, because they're trying to cram so much onto a page, which is understandable, because otherwise you'd have course books that are this size. Maybe sometimes the font can be a serif font. Quite often in print, serif fonts are preferable, but or are chosen by publishers, but actually sans serif fonts are much more accessible.
And for example, when you look at course books, there's often debate about how much white space there is on the page, not on the page. How important is that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say white space is really important.
Now, the context we're using today is a set of PowerPoints. So this might be a set of PowerPoint, for example, if you were teaching an online lesson, we might give students a PowerPoint to look at, but equally it could be the page in a book, it could be the page on a worksheet. The basic principles here are the same. Do you just want to tell us what we're looking at initially? What's the context for this material?
Okay, the context, well, it was based on a big packing expedition that I did with a friend. So this is just an example though. So it's just a quick example material that I made. The main aim of this task is really, well, the main aim here for us is to look at the background and the layout and the font size, etc. So basically this is an example of pretty much everything that you can do wrong.
Okay.
Don't do this. Firstly, there is a beautiful picture, yes, but the problem with putting the text on top of the picture is that the contrast is very difficult to, the contrast of colors makes it very difficult to read the text. Also, the font size is too small. Generally, when you talk about font size, this is size 14 point, which is fine in a Word document. It's actually the recommended size in a Word document. 12 minimum, 14 best practice in a Word document. But on a PowerPoint presentation, it's very hard to see, especially if it's far away. So I think, well, in a PowerPoint presentation, you would go for, they say minimum 24 point, but actually I think that's still too small. I would go for 36 or 40. And in if you're teaching students online and they're on their mobiles, I would make the font even bigger because mobiles are tiny. So yeah, the size is too small. The background is has a problem with contrast of colors. It makes it difficult to read. The colors themselves, so you've got a green color, a yellow color. Yellow is just really difficult to read in general. White on this background in the bottom corner can be difficult to see too. Then you're talking about italics. So italics are more difficult. The slope of the letters makes it more difficult to read. And then there's the fact that it's a serif font. So a serif font is fonts that have little flicks or tails.
Right.
So this is Times New Roman, which is the default on Word and PowerPoint and things like that. But in actual fact, sans serif fonts are much more easy to read.
Okay, so there's a number of issues here, isn't there?
Yeah.
If we're designing this for a worksheet, we could go with size font 14 and change the fonts, perhaps. If you're looking at a PowerPoint, say in a Zoom lesson, you're saying take it up to maybe even up to sort of 36 size. What if I was doing a face-to-face class and I put this material onto my interactive whiteboard in a classroom? It would still be what, 30?
Yeah, so if you're doing like a talk at a conference or maybe in a classroom, you'll be 36 minimum, 40 would be best practice.
Right.
But yeah, if you're on a mobile phone, if your students are on a mobile phone and you are in Zoom, I would put it up to 50 if you know a lot of your students are on mobiles.
I mean, I think the issue of I've just stopped sharing because I think the issue of mobile phones is interesting. Does it require us to completely rethink the way we design materials? I think it's a real issue that a lot of us are battling with. How do we take, if we prepared a slide for a Zoom lesson and then we discover that our students actually following the lesson on a mobile phone? I think it's hugely problematic. I mean, I've even heard some people say, well, I don't think you can't really run a lesson if the students are working on mobile phones, but the reality is that many of them are. So I do think that's a question. Mm-hmm. That constant question is coming up now. What will this look like on the mobile phone screen? And It's interesting that you're saying make the fonts bigger because that, in a sense, reduces the quantity of information we could put on the phone. So our materials design, our exercise design is totally transformed. It's maybe something we'll need to come back to. Let's go back to the slide and let's move to the next slide. So what have we got going on here?
Okay, so this is red and green, as you can see. And red and green are not great for learners who are colorblind. Red and green is probably the worst color combination you can have, I think. So avoid when you're thinking about the color contrast of your background, it's best to go for a light or off-white color and dark text. So the red here, I guess, isn't really dark enough. It's not contrasted enough, and then it is a big problem. Green and red can be quite a big problem if you're colorblind, as I said. So that is the main problem.
Yeah, I mean, for colorblind, but even I'm not colorblind and looking at it, it's
exactly
not great to read. What you have changed, of course, is to make the photo smaller instead of making the photo this big backdrop.
Yeah.
The photo gives us context. It helps us to place what the lesson is about, where we are. But it's just neatly to one corner, so it's out of the way. So that is picking up on the improvement there as well. If we go to the next one, we can see what you've done here. You've removed the background. We've got black and white. So at least we've helped solve that problem. But what are the remaining problems we've still got going on?
Yeah, there's still remaining problems. So firstly, the text is all in bold and the heading's all in bold. The heading's also got an underline on it. And generally, if you're showing emphasis or using a heading or creating a rubric, I would go for bold for emphasis. Underlines can also make things a little bit more difficult to read.
Right.
Italics. So there's italics in the text, which again makes things more difficult to read. And you've got your serif font, which is still Times New Roman, so it'd be better to change it to a sans serif font.
Okay, if somebody's designing a worksheet on their own, is the best thing is just to go for a single font for everything, including the questions and the text, or is it worth doing the text? Like if it's suggesting it's from an article or something, is it worth doing it in a slightly different font so it looks like here's the text and here are the questions that go with it? Or would you just do the whole thing in the same font normally?
Personally, I would do this whole thing in the same font, but I mean, I guess it's up to that person, whoever's designing it. But so long as the font is accessible and easy to read, so long as it's a sans serif font, not in italics, and only in bold for the rubrics and headings.
Just to clarify, so a sans serif font would include what? Arial? What
Yeah.
else?
Arial, Calibri, Trebuchet. I'm going to take you through those actually, and
All right.
Comic Sans as well.
Let's go back. Let's move
and
on.
Century Gothic.
Okay.
So, okay, and the other problem with the last slide was that it was 24-point font. So it's still a bit too small. So this slide, we have increased the font to 36, which does mean that you now have your text on one slide and your questions on another. But I think that's okay. And I think that's probably preferable. And you could, if you're on an online class, you can maybe send the questions via chat room or in another way.
And particularly if you've got students on mobile phones,
exactly,
you're going to have to do it this way, aren't you? Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if you're in an online class, the key is to continuously ask your students, can you see it? Is it big enough?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this one, I have changed it to, which font was it? I think it's Calibri. It's Calibri with italics. And so the font, the slope of the letter still isn't great, but it's a sans serif font. But the other thing that's interesting about Calibri in italics is the A and the G. So I teach a lot of ESOL literacy students. So these are learners who have whose first script is not English. So they're learning English script for the first time. So this could also be an issue if you're teaching young learners and they haven't learned to read and write using Roman script yet. So when you look at the A and the G, you'll see that they're handwritten A and G. But on the next slide, if you flip to the next slide, this is Calibri. So the last slide was Calibri with italics. This is Calibri with no italics, but you'll notice that the A and the G have changed.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I'm focused on the word Glasgow, and if I just go back to the previous slide, you get there with a normal A and a normal G, and we go forward, we get it typeset. And yeah, for students who, I think that's incredibly confusing, isn't it?
Yeah, the first time a student sees it, and actually I remember seeing it as a child and having to ask my teacher, what is this?
Especially the G, yeah. The G,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just something to think about. I mean, if your students are very familiar with Roman script, that's completely fine to use this, but it might be something to consider if you're teaching young learners or students who are new to Roman script.
I mean, students will be exposed to it. So from a reading point of view, certainly they need exposing to it.
Exactly,
but from them, if you, like you say, if you're helping them to form letters or their beginners elementary or their script isn't, their own L1 script isn't similar to English letters, that's, big problem.
Yeah, so I actually have students who copy this A and copy this G. And imagine trying to handwrite that G. It's difficult. It's difficult enough trying to, if you're learning a new language, to do the handwriting G, but trying to copy that one's just makes it far too hard.
Yeah, okay, interesting point. Let's move on to the next one. So what's happening here?
Okay, so you'll notice that I'm changing the background color, so they're all light colors, quite off-white. This is, what font is this one? Sorry. This one's Arial font. So again, you've got the funny A and funny G. I'm not sure what oh no, the G is actually okay, but the A is the printed version of the A.
But I'm finding that pretty clear to read. What's the significance difference between, on the previous you had a white background, on this one it's tinted? What does that do?
Yeah, I think just so long as the background has a big contrast to the color of the text. It doesn't matter what kind of off-white it is, so long as it's kind of off-white and it's light.
In the literature for dyslexic-friendly materials, you sometimes get stuff about students it's better if they have a certain colored background, although I interviewed John Herder recently about this, and he said he'd read that, and some research suggests you need to sort of have certain tint colored background. But actually, in his experience, quite a few dyslexic students have said, "Can you just keep it black and white?"
Yeah.
Thing. So I haven't found anything conclusive on this yet.
Yeah, and I think it all depends on the students. I think, as I said, just keep asking your students, "Can you read this? Okay, is it easy enough to read?" Okay, so the next one is Trebuchet. So again, funny A and even funnier G, or And but the font size is okay, the background's okay. Okay, so this is another sans serif font, so that's Comic Sans. So Comic Sans is quite well used for young learners. And when I first started teaching adult literacy, that was my preferred font. But lots of people say it's kind of for kids. And the reason that this font is good is because it's got handwriting G and handwriting A. But yeah, it depends on your learners, and some learners might
It
find
does
it a
have
bit
a sort of
childish.
an association about it, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
I've written materials for sort of teenagers, your younger learners, and I might use Comic Sans. But if I'm writing materials for business English students, then I wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just that it kind of instantly, there's something about it that sort of says more young learners, isn't there?
Yeah. So just it's just something to be aware of. But it is a sans serif font. So yeah, Calibri, Trebuchet, Arial, the last few that we've just looked at are all okay. Same with Comic Sans as well. Are all accessible.
Right. What have we got here?
This is my preferred font for teaching literacy learners. This is a Century Gothic, and it's got handwriting A and handwriting G. It's sans serif, and I think it's really clear. And the background's okay in this one too. It's 36-point font. The heading's in bold, so this would be my preferred one, but any of the other 3 or 4 that we just looked at with the 36-point font and the light background.
Let's just take a pause there. You're saying that the Century Gothic's your preferred font. What sort of led you to make the decision about it? Is it just from observing the way students have reacted to text, or what's led you?
Yeah, pretty much. Just kind of developed it over time.
Yeah.
So I think we started off on Trebuchet, but yeah, because it's mostly because I teach ESOL literacy learners. If I taught learners whose script was all Roman script, like if I was teaching Spanish learners, Italian learners, I probably wouldn't have chosen that. I would probably have just be perfectly happy with any sans serif font. But because my learners are predominantly maybe Farsi speakers or Arabic speakers, I prefer fonts that have the handwriting A and the handwriting G. So that's my preference. But because otherwise they do just copy the printed A and G.
Let's take a look at the next one. So we're on to the questions now. So we've worked with the text. What tips do you have on in terms of writing comprehension questions or the exercises?
Okay, so the question here is not in bold, so it's not standing out as being a rubric. But the problem with the Century Gothic, and it's the one downfall that Century Gothic has in my eyes, is the very odd question mark. So when you get to the end, you're thinking, what is that? And then you don't want students copying that. That's for sure.
Like an S backwards, isn't it?
Yeah, and then they don't understand it. So what I do with Century Gothic questions is I change them to Calibri or to Arial or to Trebuchet. Yeah, so the next one.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you flick forward 2 slides, I think. Another slide. Yeah, okay, so this slide is probably best practice. So line spacing is 1.5, so it's easier.
Sorry, this is still Century Gothic, yeah?
Yeah, this is Century Gothic, but I've changed the question marks to Calibri.
Okay.
Or to Arial, just to a regular looking question mark.
Right.
And the rubric is in bold. And then I've added some line spacing because it makes it easier to read.
Okay, now we're back to the text.
This is the text with 36-point font. It's got 1.5 line spacing. It is a sans serif font, so it's Century Gothic. It has a light background or an off-white background. It's got bold on the heading. So this would probably be as best practice as you could get. It's quite a long text, so it would be nice to have a bit more space at the side of the slides, but that doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite fit with the size of the text, sadly, and the 1.5 spacing.
What would you do, because this text is clearly for lower levels, if you were teaching, say, a B1, B2 class and you were using a longer reading text, how would you handle that?
I guess it would be, if it was an online class, I guess it would be giving them the document as a Word document and maybe getting them to read it on their own computers.
So you wouldn't necessarily share it on the screen?
Yeah, I'd maybe share bits of it. You could always scroll down through it.
Yeah, or chunk it.
Yeah, and then the bonus of having a Word document or a Google Docs or whatever, you can always increase the font size or zoom in or zoom out as well.
Right.
To ask your learners when's good. So yeah, this is just a summary slide. So for accessible layout, I would say background light or off-white, font sans serif and not italics, because italics makes it more difficult to read. Text color, dark gray or black. Size, if you're using PowerPoint slides, 36 or 40 minimum. Word documents, minimum of 12, but preferred 14. But if your students are learning online, obviously try and increase that or have a way of zooming in. Put your headings in bold or your rubrics in bold or anything for emphasis in bold, and use 1.5 line spacing.
Thanks very much, Emily. That's been really useful. If people want to know more about your work and read more of your thoughts and ideas on materials design and so on, where should they look?
My website is emilybrysonelt.com.
Okay.
And actually, in September, I am going to be starting my first online course in graphic facilitation. So if you want to know more about graphic facilitation and how to use it in the English language classroom to engage your learners, you can go to emilybrysonelt.com and find more information about that. Yeah, or you can get me on Twitter at @E_Bryson as well.
Big thanks to Emily for sharing her time and her knowledge on the subject of creating accessible learning materials. Hope you found a few things in there that you can apply to your own materials design. Just to remind you, if you want to find out more about Emily's work and the courses that she's going to run in the future, go to Emily Bryson ELT. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and catch the next video in this series on ELT materials writing.